Hello, everybody. Well, I felt like I needed to make a video about this. No, not Galadriel doing a power pose man spread on the cover of a magazine. This right here, her sword. The main points of this video are to one, ask the question, is her sword elf-like? Does it make sense in the universe of Lord of the Rings? And secondly, is it at all practical? Does anything like this exist in the real world? It actually seems like Galadriel has potentially two swords. So there are a few images that we got where she has a sword slung over her shoulder or on her back, and the sword actually looks fairly typical, aside from the fact that it looks maybe a little cheap, a little too bulky in the scabbard, maybe looks a little plasticky. Aside from that, the proportions for the handle look pretty standard and what most people are used to. But in these other two images here, we actually see a different sword where the handle is much longer. And some people have joked that it's a five-handed handle. It's so large, looks so impractical. Why on earth would you have a sword with, a handle that big? Right, makes no sense is what some of these guys are saying. And if you look at, some of the pictures here, the handle does look pretty long. So the two questions that we want to answer are, is there anything like this in Lord of the Rings? Is there a precedent for elves having swords with such long handles? And then two, has anything like this existed historically? So first off, let's start off with the first question. Do elves have anything like this in Lord of the Rings? And if you look at these two images here that I'm showing of the high elf warrior that we see at the very beginning of the first movie, and they're using this sword. And this sword has a really long handle compared to the blade. And if you get if you happen to get a replica version of the sword by United Cutlery, you'll see that the handle and the blade length are almost exactly equivalent in length, or that the handle and the blade are the same size. If you want to check that out, I actually have a short showing my sword. So yeah, elves in The Lord of the Rings, at least in the movie directed by Peter Jackson, have swords with really long handles. So I don't really see an issue there. Now, the next thing is, has anything like this existed historically, right? Is it practical in any way, shape, or form? And you might be surprised to know that, historically, across a whole bunch of different cultures, there are swords with really long handles. The first one is actually from Japan. It's called a nagamaki. Sure, I'm not pronouncing that right. But the blade length and the handle length are pretty close to the same, pretty equivalent. And Metatron actually did a video talking about this, and he says that the high elf sword was based on the nagamaki. I'm not sure if that's true, because the nagamaki seems to have one basically curve that goes throughout the whole sword, so the sword kind of looks more like a bow, and the elf sword kind of has a gentle S shape, which brings me to the next sword here, a Filipino sword called a panavas. Again, probably not pronouncing that right, but that kind of has a little bit more of that S-shaped curve, and reminds me a lot of the high elf warrior sword. This next image here is actually a couple different swords from India, and you'll see that there's actually several of them that have long handles. Moving right along, this next image here is actually a Persian sword, and again you'll see quite a long handle for the blade. And finally, this last image here you'll see is a Danish greatsword, I believe from the 15th century or so. And something that's characteristic of these greatswords is the handles are often about a third of the total sword length. So again, they're actually handles are pretty large. And looking at Galadriel's sword, it reminds me a lot of sort of these Danish greatswords. Um, and it looks like her handle is about a third of the size of the total length of the sword. And historically, that was a real type of sword design. So yeah, overall, I think Galadriel's sword. Well, what if we want to debate if she should have a sword or not? That's a totally different thing, right? But as far as the sword design itself, I don't actually think is flawed. I think it looks pretty good, um, aside from the sort of plasticky look that it has. But the dimensions and everything, totally fine with it. Totally plausible design historically. I think it fits fine within what we know of the Lord of the Rings from what we've been shown. So yeah, overall, no issue there. I think it works totally fine, surprisingly well. I would want to own one of these, assuming it wasn't cheap and plasticky looking. All right, well, goodbye.